6 years the creation of a really strong global network where we have a continental network in Africa, created in December 2012. We have an invigorated Latin American network. We have a restructured North American network. We have an Asian Oceania network. We even have what we call an embryonic network for the Fertile Crescent area in the Middle East. And this is a complement to the Gen Europe organization, which is the strongest, by far the strongest region. What's interesting is each part of the world has maybe its own unique character. And we are in the process of trying to strengthen the network by increasing organization in each part of the world so that each continent has a central office with officers who represent and connect out to national groups. We have national networks in maybe 6 countries of Latin America, in 4 or 5 countries in Africa, in maybe 4 or 5 countries in Asia, in about 20 countries of Europe. There's the national networks. So, for example, in Gen Europe, we allow both individual communities to be members directly of the continental organization, but we also have national networks that can organize many more communities. And these are communities that maybe do not feel engaged enough in the international work to be direct members of the continental organization, but they choose just to be a member of the national network, and thus they don't have the language problems of working internationally. So we are able to have monthly meetings and share exactly what is happening in the different parts of the world, and to try to spread new successes from one region of the world to another. So the work with green schools in Africa is being spread to other parts of the world. The successes with working with eco-village incubation, supporting new communities, has spread from Europe and is spreading to other parts of the world. So we have these exchanges of ways of working. Jake and I have worked together on this. We were in Brazil last year in October, where we had a global meeting, as well as a Latin American meeting, as well as the Brazilian national meeting. And so NextGen has its own experience, which Jake can talk about, which, just like Gen, has been building up networks of engaged young people and communities around the world. One thing I can say, NextGen is actually been at this very recently. That's why I think it's really interesting to hear from Jake. At you could say the Gen level, we've actually been working on this since 1995. So it's quite old, but we were quite sleepy. It was a very loose network until about 2011-12, when we really decided to up the game and make a more strong and professionalized organization with a secretariat in Finhorn. So before that, it was a very loose network, having regular talks, but not really trying to build up an organization behind the network. And now we have an organization behind the network, which is actually able to fund a part-time position in every part of the world, so that we can ensure that we have a basic flow of information. And I think that is working really well right now. And we're still trying to identify the areas where we're not present. For example, in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, where we're just in progress with expanding our networks. We have sent Camila from the Gen Europe network this weekend in Kiev, where there's a meeting ongoing of eco-villages of Ukraine, creating a national network there. So it's a constant expansion of trying to create a real global network. So without saying much more, I would like to invite Jake to come in and tell about the the more recent and fresh work of structuring next gen at the global level.
Good morning, everybody. Is this an okay volume? Yes, no, I can't really. Yes, cool. Yes, so before I comment more on that structure itself, I want to say, so one thing I've found over and through sort of researching and talking to lots of people, and we NextGen have found, is one of the sort of more important learnings for us to always come back to when growing or when adding individual people to teams or sort of whole regions or countries, is to really understand and remember that for a network to work, all the parts of it need to have some sort of a sense of ownership over the network itself. You can't just sort of, it doesn't work if you just call up, like for instance in Gen, if a new eco-village just joins and they pay a membership fee, they're not really part of the network. They won't feel so inclined often to say come to events or to speak out or to participate. For sure, paying a fee can bring a sense of ownership because they're like, I want to get my money's worth. But especially if you're not, or even sometimes with a fee, you need to find other ways to generate that sense of ownership and connection, which can be relatively easy. And we've seen this happening quite rapidly within the national networks of Gen, because obviously people have quite a strong sense of connection. If the network is in their language or the network is their country's network, often the cultural inclinations in people and sort of, I think the tribal inclinations means people find it easy to connect to that. But as soon as you bring this up to like even the European level, never mind the international level, it can be quite hard to sort of keep people's interest, keep people's focus, especially in the earlier periods where often it's just like another thing to pour time and energy into, often without anything obvious and sort of tangible coming back to the projects on the ground, or in your case, the farms on the ground, or sometimes even just the people. They're like, I'm putting in a lot here, and I just seem to, even just I'm writing stuff for 2 websites now, and like I need to keep 2 pages on 2 different websites up to date. And I was like, man, this is a lot of work. And what we found is one of the best ways to do this is by paying close attention to the decision making and the flow of information. So how is the information flowing from what might more traditionally be seen as the top of the organization down to the grassroots and the people on the ground, and up, so up and down and sort of out sideways? And how do we include and create a sort of a sense of equivalence in the decision-making process so that the people on the ground don't feel like they're being told what to do? Especially in Gen, where at our heart and our core, we are a grassroots organization. We grew out of the eco-villages. Most people live in eco-villages. Most of the knowledge, the education, the wisdom is coming from the eco-villages. In fact, if all the eco-villages went, we've had enough of this, the organization would fall apart pretty quickly, I think, even with these really quite strong offices. At the same time, the people in these offices, and especially when you have like executive positions, they need quite a high level of autonomy to be able to spend the money they have in the way they think is right, or the way they know is right, because they're in this position that probably has access to information. And it just isn't practical to wait for, say, people all over the world to support every decision. You need to be able to sort of make decisions on the fly. When you include young people into the equation, and you look at the fact that a lot of the trauma in the world right now in amongst young people is directly to do with feeling like decisions have been made by the generations directly preceding us that have left us in a bit of a mess. Nowadays, you see it's quite a disempowering situation to be in. And so it means it's like, if you want to gain, I have found if I want to gain the interest of other young people, and this is coming directly from my own analyzing myself and going, why am I interested in being involved in Gen? Why do I keep putting my energy in from the age of 1920 to 26. It is directly because I was given a place to make decisions. I was put in a position where I was, from a relatively young and pretty inexperienced age, I was given the place to make decisions that would impact me. There's rarely been a moment in Gen where a decision was made that would impact me that I couldn't have had an influence on. And how this works in Next Gen specifically is we've split ourselves up into regions. So we have Next Gen Europe, Casa Jóvenes in Latin America, Next Gen Africa, and each all the same as Gen, except we're not currently, let's say, emerging in the Fertile Crescent at the moment. And then each region of Next Gen itself, the sort of core committed group of people, elect 2 people. And these 2 people from each region meet once a month in what we call the Next Gen Youth Council. And this enables all the regions of Next Gen to make decisions together that affect, if there's a decision that needs to be made that affects more than one region, we make it together and we have conversations about overall vision and targets and mission. And from there, that circle elects 2 representatives to sit directly on the board of Gen, which means we as the young people have 2 full voting places on the board of Gen. So we are able to check to make sure that everything that Gen is doing is aligned with our own more youthful vision and our aims. We have room to lead, we have room to put like one target, should we wish ourselves to nominate one target to put on Gen's overall plan. And the other side is it means that we in Next Gen are then able to get information directly from the board to know how we can best serve the greater organization. So we're able to then check to make sure that the work we're doing all the way down to the individual projects all over the world are aligned with the sort of the larger plan. And that accountability goes up and down. We use, or we base a lot of this structure and the theory behind how this works on a methodology called Sociocracy 3.0 in Europe, which is born out of something called Sociocracy in Europe. And it relies heavily on a culture of like transparency and equivalence and like accountability, and really sharing that. And it fits quite closely with a lot of our ethoses in eco-villages of sort of more high levels of responsibility in yourself, and also allowing your feelings and emotions to guide you without them necessarily being a hindrance. The only other thing I want to add is that one of the sort of elders from the eco-village movement, a guy called John Buck, he recently, we were asking him about the importance of including young people in your projects, and he gave us a little snippet that was quite scary, because he was talking on the same topic of ownership, and he was saying, like, look, if you invite new people into your project, it will only work if it becomes your project, like the collective. If you bring new people in, they need to end up having the same sense of ownership over it as you do. And for that to happen, the project itself actually has to like die. And then a new project has to be reborn out of it, which is obviously quite a scary thought, because if you've been working on a project for 5 years, 10 years, 20, 30 years, that realization of, as you guys are building this international network dream, the chances are, as more and more people die, at some point everything will collapse and something new will come up. And the reality is that's pretty much inevitable. You've just got to decide whether or not you want it to be like quick and clean and controlled, and with everyone there having a real say in it. Otherwise, it's probably going to be quite long and drawn out and difficult and painful, and people will probably end up leaving. And we found in Europe that the best way to facilitate it is to allow, in Next Gen in Europe specifically and internationally, is to allow a few individual people to give them more power and control early on, to do the initial building up and designing and setting. And so there is like a fully fledged plan that everyone can subscribe to. Is this is good enough. This is good enough. You've got our attention. then everyone joins in, and then when everyone's there together, you can start tweaking and changing. Because if you try and do the initial building and dreaming and envisioning with too many people, it just doesn't really work. It just takes too long. So I just wanted to put that insight in.
I think that really matches very well what I said on Friday to the group about ego and like an egocentric network and an ecocentric network, that initially you do need to show this leadership. People don't see the network, maybe. They don't see their role in the network, and there needs to be some firm leadership which structures up things and shows how we will be relating to each other, and what is the scope and what is the goal and the mandate of the network. And then once it's set up, it's possible, and it's encouraged to release some of that concentration out to the different members who take on a greater and greater role, and thus eases the burden of those who had to take the initial stronger role. So it's both lightens the load for those who initially were very active, but also it makes a much more vibrant network when everyone can participate, everyone can influence the network. We've had a lot of learning, so everything, you learn a lot from mistakes, and we've had different relationships, how to capture this incredible energy of the youth. There's many youth both in eco-villages who grew up in eco-villages like Jake, but also a lot of young people from the cities who are disillusioned by what society is offering them and looking for something else. Some of them may, of course, come to your farms and temples, but we have young people coming that don't yet belong to an eco-village and don't really know how to join an eco-village or not sure about how to do it, and then come into Next Gen. So we've had this relationship between Gen, which is the organization of, I would say, more stable organization based on communities, established communities. And then we have the youth group, which maybe has a foot in the communities, but a foot outside. And how we bring in that energy, but without compromising the democracy that all these communities have elected a leadership of the Gen network, and how to bring in the youth. So it's been in different ways. And in Europe we had previously a separate organization for Next Gen, which elected people into the European Council. And then it was decided a few years ago, no, we would prefer that the Next Gen people put forward candidates who are elected with the same mandate as the adults representing the communities, and in that way give them a platform that is equal to anyone else, that they're not special, youth representatives, which is the situation we have at the international board today, but we integrate the youth and elect them at the open annual meeting in the same way we elect anyone else to the Gen Europe board. So this has been sort of the growing pains, and I think it's part of an ongoing process to know how to integrate. And I think maybe Jake has better information that this is maybe done in different ways in different parts of the world.
Yeah, the relationship, when I talked to it, was more about the relationship that, say, within Next Gen, between its own little networks, which is very strong. I'd say there's a high sense of I'd even go so far as to say there's a high sense of sisterhood and brotherhood between the different regions. We have these monthly calls with young people living in wildly different socioeconomic backgrounds in different countries, making decisions together about how to spend money, what projects to focus on, how we can support each other. I attended this conference in Brazil because the people in Brazil the young people wanted me to be there in large part. And that was money that theoretically, initially I was invited using money that they could have spent on bringing other people from Latin America, but it was so important to them to have someone from the wider youth network there. They wanted to show the other people in their network, the people who were connected internationally, how broad it was and how we were on the similar level. In the end, I went with other money. Has happened. Sometimes money does magically, almost magically appear. And internationally, it's quite strong, but between each Next Gen region, like Next Gen Europe and Gen Europe, or Casa Latina, Casa Jóvenes, Casa Youth, that's the youth side, the relationship is quite different, varies quite wildly between regions. In North America, it's pretty strong. And they actually, in the North American network, they rely on the youth in their network, the Next Gen, quite heavily to do almost all of their networking, because they found that a sort of little quirk of the eco-villages and communities in North America is they weren't really interested in networking, because everyone who lived in one was very happy on their bit of land where they lived, and they didn't really want to move. And then they were like, but wait, we've got all these young people who want to do nothing but move. They don't want to stay in one place. And so they sort of make use of it, and the young people move around a lot, doing the networking and setting up projects and building that sense of kinship across the communities. In Africa, the teams are pretty similar. Like, it's pretty much the same people working on the Gen Africa and the Next Gen Africa stuff, mainly because most of them are quite young anyway. And so Next Gen Africa is more just the name given to the youth-focused projects. And this is something to be clear. Next Gen, we have people working on Next Gen projects who are not young. What we just need, because they might be the right person to be working on the job. If they've got a PhD in education, we're not going to say, no, you can't be involved in our educational project. But we make it clear that it should always be someone under the age of 30 or 35 in the positions of leadership. And that has been where we've, in Europe, encountered some resistance from some of the people within the eco-village network. So there have been times where, even though the existing Gen Europe Council and the staff might be quite open to Next Gen itself putting someone on the council, and because they trust us and we communicate with them a lot, as Robert said, the actual eco-villages themselves, the people on the ground who need this sense of ownership over the network to feel a part of it, going, wait, but why are you guys just picking someone? I didn't vote them onto the council. Why do you get to put it there? And I'd say I don't think at the moment it's in its final structure, but it was like for me, I agreed not. I still thought it wasn't worth having this fight of we need to put our own person on there, because I could see it would just be a fight that would just waste a lot of energy. And so we went, okay, this time around with the council elections, we've actually got some people who are happy to be the representative for Next Gen. There was a young person just elected by themselves. And it was like, okay, that's good. That's good enough. That's good enough for now. I don't know what will happen next time round, but it plays into this challenge of like, on one side, I always want the best person for the job in every position. And when you're looking at a council or a board of an organization, these people who are often holding a lot of vision, and you do want people there with a lot of knowledge about what works and doesn't work. And ideally, some strong wisdom there too. And that doesn't always sit in the younger people. Not always. Sometimes it does. At the same time, to bring the young people in, you need to empower them, and they need to have a sense of ownership too. And you need to look at the structures, and if, for instance, the power is coming in your organization, the people doing the voting would be the Krishna farms. If they're the people electing people during the elections to nominate and choose who sits in the positions of power of your new network as it emerges, if young people are not fully represented in the leadership positions within the farms, then you need to figure out a way to, maybe the network might have to take some responsibility in how to introduce young people into the system by not jumping past, but by acknowledging and showing that maybe the farms themselves and this might be for very practical reasons. As I said, young people like moving around. So if the young people aren't living in a farm for long enough, they're not going to naturally gain the respect and the trust they need to sit in positions of responsibility within the farms and such. Then they're not going to be part of the decision making and elections onto the board. But you need to go, they are still there, they are still part of the network, and it's important to really identify what value are they bringing, and then to really encourage the value that they're bringing to grow, and to be, so everyone is more aware of what it is they're bringing to your network and how you can make most use of them, and to know that they probably are going to make mistakes as I've done quite a few times, and they probably are going to make more mistakes than maybe some other people. But as long as you are aware that that's probably going to happen, and when it happens you're ready for it, and you meet the mistakes with a certain level of compassion and empathy and love, and see it as an opportunity for growth, then I'd say it's not, I found that even the big scary things don't actually end up that big and scary most of the time.
I think that's a good point, Jake, that we allow the young people to fully engage themselves, and I think somehow it's working relatively well, what we have today with the next gen, as like, I wouldn't call it even a sister organization. It's a specialized category, but like a I don't know, but it's integrated.
The arm. At the moment we're saying it's the youth arm of Gen. Yeah. So you think it's relative amount of pretty high levels of autonomy, but still very firmly attached to the body, and we're doing specific youth focused stuff, but it's but we're still there. We're not our own thing. We haven't split off.
Yeah, so that would probably be counterproductive if we had it completely separated, at the same time as there may be something inherent in the fact that our communities, just as your farms, are perhaps very long-term, stable. The people in leadership positions often have this long-term, stable focus, which means they also don't have perhaps often immediate energy for big things happening tomorrow. And a lot of the young people have perhaps a lot of energy for new innovation and things on a very short-term perspective, because their life is not maybe planned out in detail, and thus they have the energy to put it in. And we'd like to harness that energy. And I think we can actually see in every part of the world how we have allowed or the youth has been given the possibility to make their own profile, do their own thing, and thus add something to the Gen network that wouldn't have otherwise existed. So a lot has been happening, like you just explained, Jake, in North America with the networking, which I think is something young people do all over the world. There's also been a lot of stories about what's going on, for example, with the next gen youth in South Korea. There are a lot of energy there who actually were able to organize an EDE and invite Chinese youth to South Korea, who went back to China and were working on networking in China. So a lot of things that were happening because the youth had the possibility to organize things themselves and still be supported by the wider network. So it's been, I mean, we're sort of trial and error, fumbling ourselves forward in how to create this organization to harness the youth and not push the youth away, at the same time as having our long-term stable organization, which we need as well. So it's an interesting dance that we have.
The conferences, it's a good place. If you guys plan on having more of these sort of events and conferences, young people, it's like you look at it like this: young people want to attend them because they want to know what's going on and they want to meet people. They often don't have as much money, which means they can't afford to get there off their own back. and they probably don't have the sort of positions within the existing communities that the community is willing to support them in the same way they would more established members. However, they're also young people that are totally up for and have energy for working and have energy for experimenting and have energy for running around. So we found it very successful in the various regions of Gen to give, like, as long as you have one or two more experienced sort of coordinators or planners in positions of responsibility, you can actually hand over most of the work of running and planning and organizing your events to a small group of dedicated, committed young people. And you do that in return for covering their costs, or maybe even paying them a little bit. And we have found that this to be pretty effective. I mean, in Europe, in the last year's conference, there was a core conference organizing team, but then there is larger conference. And we were able to also fund this through like Erasmus Plus and things like that, which I know some of you are aware of in the room there. So we're able to, like, through EU funding, provide training and education and work experience for young people who then got to attend our conference last summer in Europe and the year before and do a pretty amazing job of it. In Latin America, they didn't have the EU funding, but the young people had the time to show up at the eco village that was going to host the conference last year between 3 months to 3 weeks before the conference, because they didn't have as much going on in their life, and they just built everything. And then they also organized key core parts of the conference because they had a little bit more time too. So it's about really going, okay, what are the young people's needs? What is it they can bring? What are our needs? And where can we match them and meet them? Is quite important and works.
We were really astounded the last 2 years when our conference has been growing from several hundred, 300, 400 persons. The last few years, it's 500-600 persons attending the conference. But there was the radical change which Jake was talking about, where we let in large groups of volunteers. Before it was, we had a small group of 15 or 20 volunteers. In the recent year, we were allowing, over 100 volunteers to come and help facilitate the conference. And this is cooking, cleaning, and other chores, but as well, you're allowed to participate in the conference. And it's not just confused, disillusioned young people not knowing what to do with their lives. Extremely well-educated, well organized young people that were extremely focused on eco-villages and eco-villages' influence on the wider society. There was so many that were like writing their bachelor's thesis, their master's thesis on something related to the subject matter. So it was astounding that we opened up this door, and all these people that have previously not attended our conferences were suddenly coming to our conferences, because I think they existed before 2 years ago. It's just they were never had the opportunity, because our threshold of our conference fees was keeping away people that were really should be there, and which we have a huge benefit now that they are coming. So we really tech to have young people we protect with. Perhaps we should ask exactly how much time we have for this session.
We're having a little bit of internet delay. If you could turn off your internet, if anybody has internet on, because it sucks so bandwidth. But the call was pretty good, much better than on the previous day. We got a very clear delivery. Yes, we have another 20 minutes, I would say, and I think it's a good moment to interact with the representatives which are here. I personally gained a lot from your explanation. We may be desiring some questions, some interaction. Would anybody be interested to make a question to Robert or Jake or both? We have a question. Just a moment. I'm going to hand over the microphone. And
Hi, Bhavan. I'm losing my voice, so I'll keep on question. It's not actually a question. It's more a seeking advice, and that is that because this particular section that you're speaking on, particularly Jacob is speaking on, is the next generation and the youth being involved in what we do. I would say that that is, as a general rule, an area that we as an organisation struggle with. So I'm wondering, are there any kind of universal tips that you might have to offer us that are attractive and kind of hook points for getting the next generation involved?
Don't be you can't hide away from the trauma. Like there is a lot of pain currently in the world being projected back and forth between the younger generations and the elder generations, and then the more elders being the people who have often stepped out of positions of power, the younger people who are yet to get into the positions of power, and then those that are already in those positions. There's a lot of pain, there's a lot of feeling like victimhood, there's a lot of blaming each other, and it's, from my experience within Gen, whenever there's the things that have actually enabled us to move forward the most have been when we've created spaces to deal with and work with and share some of that, and just to make it visible. Even if it's just in the form of discussion, and even if it's just to one side, just to have that going on somewhere, so that that energy, let's say, is being dealt with. So this year at the conference, we just made sure to have a space on the schedule. I think we entitled it like Youth in Communities, the Challenges and Gifts. And it was just a space for people of any age to come and have a facilitated and held discussion on this topic. At other times, we've had full-blown processes with facilitated and really held, because it has to be done properly, with 50 people, where they're, you know, people are getting very emotional and delving inside, or coming out in some ways. But it's like, that is there. And if you don't pay attention to it and you just sort of suppress it rather than welcoming it into the room, it's just going to end up screwing everything up and breaking everything up. And no amount of clever organizational planning and theoretical thinking and who's in what place is actually going to help when people have got a lot of pain inside them that's unexpressed.
Yeah, I think it's also hard understanding in which constellations, as you are now creating networks, exactly who will be able to participate, and yeah, and what groups do they represent. We've also, in many times throughout Gen's history, made a conscious effort of seeing, when we send people to a network meeting, to try to see if we have different parts of our communities represented, if that's possible. And as well, there is, because most of you are representing places in Europe, we do have these lovely funding possibilities. And these offer both opportunities for young people, but it also offers people over 30 or 35 years to all participate in these type of events that can be funded by the Erasmus Plus Youth program.
Okay, that was a very good answer. Were you satisfied? Yes, very good. Any other questions in the room? Any other comments? Any other interaction with Robert and Jake? Yes, we have a question here.
Hello, my name is Karuna. I'm just wondering, it's a simple question. Do you have many spiritual organizations as members of
Yeah, I think I would estimate that around 1/3 of the membership of, let's speak about Gen Europe, make it simpler than talking globally. I would say about 1/3 of Gen Europe I would categorize as spiritual communities, and this is a very wide definition of coming from various backgrounds. At the same time, I would say that there is at least one more third where you have a diverse spirituality in the communities themselves, more of a diverse. So it doesn't follow one spiritual path, but there's many, maybe representatives for several spiritual paths within the community. That's at least 2/3 of the communities could be considered in that way to be spiritual communities, even if they have diverse spirituality. One thing is clear about Jen is we talk about in our eco-village design education, one of the points of culture is to have socially engaged spirituality is considered a core value of the Gaia Mandala, which is basically the basic education for eco-villages. So that we have perhaps 1/3 of our communities that would not consider themselves connected to spirituality. I don't know if Jake, if you, and also I would like to say before, that's Europe. What we have found when we work internationally is that the level of spirituality in our communities outside of Europe is much greater than it is in Europe. So that things are very obvious in Latin America or in Africa or in Asia, which are not fully comfortable in Europe, where you have this, perhaps there is a history of the leftist commune, etc., which exists in Europe, which you do not find very much outside of Europe. So that we have some resistance to spirituality in communities in Europe, which you do not really find outside of Europe. Jake, you have a confirmation or rebuttal?
Yeah, I mean, I just add that let's say that I'd say that to add on to what Robert was saying, that third of communities that he said are like, would maybe be self-described as spiritual. That's the thing, is that they're probably those third in Europe. They're the ones that make it visually part of their identity that they project into the world. But then this other third are the ones that is maybe the people who live there. A large part of them do. The individuals have a strong spiritual practice. They may even meditate together or have homegrown rituals or ceremonies or a spirituality that's grown out of the community, or a shared external, not external, but a shared spiritual practices that they subscribe to, but they're not so public about it. And that may be because there is still a strong resistance around Europe often towards there's a strong resistance often within the movement to be seen as too sort of airy-fairy, hippy-dippy, we just all meditate and play guitar and sit around a fire. And it's also to sort of give room for the just stronger activist elements within our networks who are like, hey, we're trying to do stuff here, and if we give the wrong impression, people won't take us as seriously. But it's true, if you go to Latin America, I'd say almost all of the eco-village projects that I know about have, at the very least, a strong connection to the indigenous cultures of the continent, which may not necessarily be spirituality in the way that may not be spirituality in the same way as what spirituality means to most of you in the room, at least on the surface. But for them, it's a core part of who they are. Even for the European descendants, it's very strong. And that's similar in the African projects in Genoa as well. It's obviously different. It looks different, but like in Next Gen, I'd say in the youth council, probably 9/10, like 90% or more of the people in the youth council I think, including myself, would identify as being spiritual in some sense, or having a connection to that. And it's present in most of what we do and how we do it. And the words and the language we use is very aware of the other, whatever that is. And even if for one person that might be a divine Judaic Christian God in heaven that created the heavens and the earth, for someone else it might just be the nature spirits, or for someone else it might just be something more of an indigenous practice, but it's very present.
Sorry.
It could be interesting to say that our largest communities are our spiritual communities. So the ones that have one spiritual path, they tend to be the largest communities. And the ones that are non-spiritual, or almost anti-spiritual, these are also our smallest communities. We have like the occupied village movement of Spain, which is a lot of occupied villages, but they tend to be very small. And also, they're also the ones who have had difficulties accepting a lot of the ideas around working with social tools, which is why they are also kept small.
Thank you for that. I think we have room for one more question.
Could you just expand on social tools?
There is a question in the room from Prabush. He's our senior GBC member, so he's present in the room. And he's just asking, could you expand on social tools?
Why they have a problem?
And why, the question,
Why they have a problem?
why this group have a problem with social tools?
I can say something briefly, and maybe you can then fill in the gaps, Robert. Might be easier this. So there's a woman called Diane Leaf Christian who wrote some really, really good books on, she did a lot of traveling and research into what made the communities that survive, and found, I think the statistics she came up with, it's probably not so relevant now, in part because Jen has done a lot of work to increase the number of successful communities. But when she was doing her research, it was like 9 out of 10 communities didn't last longer than a year or two, community projects that started. And what she found was in communities, there are like 3 core areas. There's like the working and the doing stuff. There's the social cohesion and hanging out and socializing together. And then I think, if I remember rightly, and then there's like the area needed for like processing and dealing with the issues that arise. And she's saying a big issue is too many communities were like working, and weren't spending enough time together. And thus, when things went wrong, they weren't really a group, because all they were doing was a bunch of people working on something together. And she talks, and that we do this now a lot in Jen, is trying to really make sure that as you're building the structures, as you're building the physical structures and the organizational structures, as you're planning and working, you're also building the personal connections between the people in the community or the network. That means when things go wrong, it's a bunch of friends or family sitting together trying to sort something out, rather than just you all of a sudden realize that actually we were working on the same thing, but I don't really know these people. And we use a vast variety of tools like nonviolent communication. I'd call sociocracy a social tool. It is helping with how to structure your organization, and how to talk in a similar language as each other when you're talking about these things. We have some more radical personal development tools out there. Some communities work closely with something called Forum, which enables is like a group sharing space, enables you to work through and get feedback from the community on your inner processes in a very public and transparent way. And that some communities rely super heavily on that. Here in Fintorn, I'd say it's as simple as before every single work shift, everyone tunes in together. So all the people who are going to be working together, say in the kitchen or even in office in the morning, everyone comes together, hold hands. They do a round where everyone gives a brief 30 seconds to a minute about how they're feeling, how they're doing right now, have a moment of silence holding hands, and then go on with the work. And then at the end of the work shift, everyone comes back together. This is how I'm doing now. Hold hands, release the energy of working together, and go about your next thing. And then also once a week, you have a more longer in-depth sharing time, just going very simple, going around in a circle, talking about how you're doing and sharing on that level with your work group, and often if you're in an educational program, with that group. And that just, it just opens up people's hearts to one another in a different way. And we do it the same in Gen. Like every meeting we have in Gen, we start with a little check-in where people can often be quite transparent about actually how they're feeling and what's going on. And it just makes everyone a little bit more aware. And I think that's partly what we talk about with social tools. And it's a mix of then personal development and then specifically like conflict negotiation and resolving and having agreements like that in place itself could be a social tool. How do we deal with conflict when it comes up, rather than just waiting for people to get angry?
That was an excellent overview by Jake there. So I really don't have much to add there. And there is an opportunity because at the Gen Europe annual conference, which will be in Italy this year in Toscana, there's normally always 4 days of workshops, and many of these topics that Jake has just mentioned, if it's social forum and open space or sociocracy, the different methods, they come up as workshops at the meeting, as well as actually seeing that they're actually being used during the 4-day meeting. Like we usually have home groups at the conference where you can digest with people, a new group, a new family of people that's created with you, a small group where you can do some sharing and actually experience that, those tools actually being used. So yeah, so decision making, conflict resolution, and also this really important thing that Jake was talking about of creating this social glue that is created by celebrations, by social activities, by sharing who you are as a person with each other. This creates this glue that allows you to survive conflict and allows you to survive crisis. So, and this is something we're actively trying to learn out, teach communities, and to through this incubator process that was now being also developed throughout Europe, is that older communities can assist newly started communities learning some of these tools.
And just to add, the word celebration has quite a strong importance for us. The man I mentioned earlier, John Buck, he developed a method called dragon dreaming that's used quite heavily in a lot of Robin, can you come back in 5 minutes, please? No, okay, there's going to be a bit of Lego noise in the background. And in Dragon Dreaming, when developing projects, he talks about how 25%, a quarter of all your time, should be spent celebrating, and how important it is. And bearing in mind that celebration includes things like grief and loss and sadness. But so when things don't work, you celebrate. When things do work, you celebrate. And this is including sociocracy. It means whenever we make a decision, we take a moment to celebrate and go, we made a decision. Yes. As a group, we should be happy about that. And whether that's dancing or whatever, it is really important to celebrate together as a community. And that really brings people together. Often in all our eco-villages, I say one of the first things to be developed is a space for celebrating in when they're building. Often before they've even built homes for everyone, they'll build a place to celebrate. Yeah.
Okay, that's all right. Say hello to Vera. Is she around?
She is possibly still asleep.
Okay.
We were out celebrating last night.
Oh, I see. Very good. Okay. Very good. Yeah, we're running out of time for this session, but I'd really like to thank you both for that beautiful session. I think for myself, it's a lot of learning. I think it resonates with the room. Yes? If you think it was good, please raise your hands. Oh, good. Is this the first time? We had a decision to listen to you, and we did. So thank you very much. It also is a kind of introduction to this methodology in our conference. That you are in Finland, Robert is in Sweden, and we're here near Glasgow in Las Mahego. And
can you tell Robert that he looks like defying gravity and his head is up in the ceiling?
Did you hear that? He said that Robert looked like he's defying gravity, but by the video it seems like he's upside down from the ceiling, right? So it's a very interesting message. Robert, thank you so much. This is the first, this is starter. We'll carry on. We were really happy. I had some further feedback about the Gen meeting. Jake and Vera was super welcoming for all our group. So we'd really like to thank you for that. And we hope to carry on our cooperation. Okay?
Hope to be seeing you in person next time. Somewhere.
Yeah, definitely. Next year will be beautiful. I'll make a point being together with you to celebrate. Hare Krishna.
Thank you so much. Hare Krishna.